This is a 2009 Toyota RAV4 with a 3.5-liter V6 2GR-FE and a 5-speed automatic transmission. I believe the code is U151E. This car is in our shop to get a new transmission, and we're going to walk you through an overview of how to replace the transmission in this vehicle. Looking up from underneath, we've gone ahead and removed the front crossmember that would run right along here, and it supports the front transmission mount. We've also removed the two side members, one on each side, that run right along here. Looking forward from the back, we've removed the white pipe and we've removed the motor mount, the rear motor mount off the cross member. To remove the white pipe, we went in the cabin and we disconnected the O2 sensor, AFR sensor, that runs from the white pipe into the cabin by the driver's footwell. Next steps in preparation on both sides: disconnect the sway bar link. I've removed the axles from both sides, and I've rehung the rotor and brake assembly, hub assembly, back on the upright. Of course, the tie rods are disconnected from the hub. I've also released the hub, the lower ball joint, from the lower control arm, which is attached to the subframe. So we've done this on both sides. This means the subframe is now free to drop, provided that the steering rack is disconnected from the steering column. I've gone in the driver's side footwell. I've pulled back the boot that covers the steering joint. I've released the outside boot from the firewall. It has two clips, bottom and top. I've match marked the intermediate shaft with the pinion, and I've undone the bolt that clamps the intermediate shaft on the pinion. So now the steering rack should pull out. To drop the subframe, I'm using a transmission jack. The only two remaining attachment points to the subframe are this bolt and its counterpart on the other side. Just two bolts, and you reach them through a hole in the lower control arm. So here it is, the complete K-frame with the steering rack attached. It came out just like butter. And here's a bonus view of the pinion with the boot coming out of the steering rack. What comes next? I'm going to go from the right side of the car to the left side of the car. I'm going to disconnect these ground lines, two ground lines that connect on top of the valve covers, one on each head. I've drained out the coolant, refrigerant from the AC. I've drained all the coolant, and I've disconnected this top radiator hose that goes into the thermostat housing. I've disconnected this AC line, which is the low side of the AC, and just set it aside over here, out of the way. Coming over to this side of the engine, I've removed the airbox, I've removed the battery and the battery tray, I've removed the radiator hose, and I've removed the throttle body from the plenum so that I can get to the fuel line, which is right underneath the throttle body, and that's where I'm going to disconnect it. I've removed the starter Starter is out. I've removed the ECU, which should have been sitting right here, and the heater hoses I've disconnected from the bypass tubes and folded them back out of the way. And so what's left for me to address is the transmission shifter cable. Okay, I'm going to disconnect that. I've disconnected both of the transmission cooler hoses that go to the radiator. And to be honest, there's not much left. Let me show you what we do next. Here is the fuel line. It has the quick connect, quick disconnect, the two blue tabs. You press them together to release. It will put up some resistance, so you just have to convince it that resistance is futile, okay? Here it is. The brake booster line is easier to disconnect right at the booster, right here, rather than the back of the plenum. Here's what you do with the wire harness going into the fuse box. You have these three connectors, you disconnect them. You have this electrical wire right here that goes on this stud with a nut. You disconnect it. Then you have two tabs, one on either side of this panel, and you just use a screwdriver to press them, and this whole thing lifts up and falls back. So now the harness is free of the body. Looking at the high side AC line, it connects into the compressor, and it has to be disconnected from the compressor. Here's a view of that AC line removed, and we just tuck it back out of the way to the side. Before I drop the assembly, I'm going to unfasten the bolts that hold the bell housing to the block on the underside of the transmission, and there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the underside of the bell housing, plus the 2 bolts for the inspection cover. So I'm going to do these now because it'll just be difficult to access later when the transmission is sitting down and engine are sitting down. While we have easy access, I'm going to undo the torque converter bolts off the Flexplate, and to get them all I just rotate the crankshaft, get each one of the bolts one by one. We've successfully dropped the drivetrain using our shop crane, and let me show you how we went about it. Positioned our custom-made shop dolly under the engine and transmission. Attach our load leveler to the engine lifting points, and I'll show you a close-up of these later. Applying tension to the crane. First, we release the bolt, center bolt for the transmission mount on the driver's side. Then we release the bolts for the motor mount on the passenger side. And then we can just simply lower the entire drivetrain. It helps to unfasten the motor mount from its mounting points so that it can wiggle freely through the mounting studs. Next, we disassemble everything that is attached to the transmission. So we have the harness connectors with the sensors. We have the transmission mounting bracket, and we have the front motor mount with its mounting bracket. So let's get all of those off. At this point, because we've already unfastened all the bolts, bell housing bolts that you reach from underneath, we just have the remaining bell housing bolts for the top. There's one here, one here, here, one here, and one here. And I believe now I'm going to show you a trick that I use to make removing the transmission easier. Now I just have these two top bolts left, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace them with these two studs with the same thread, M12 by 1.25, and I've shaped the head of the stud so I can turn it with a wrench. So now we've completely released the transmission from the block, except for the dowel pins. So to get it out, we're going to have to elevate everything again, because the entire transmission and engine are resting on the dolly, and we won't be able to move the transmission unless we elevate everything. So let me show you where we're at. We're in a pretty good place. We've got the entire weight of the assembly resting on the engine, and I've chalked the engine from underneath with some blocks of wood, and this made it tip backward, and this lifted the transmission up into the air. And the transmission, if you can see, is actually started to separate just of its own accord, and the studs that placed on the transmission are supporting its weight right now. So all we have to do is to pry the transmission back little by little, and it's gonna separate itself from the block. So there we have full separation, and the transmission pan is resting on a couple of blocks of wood. Now I'm going to wrestle the transmission onto another dolly. And there we have it, another transmission all ready for this scrap metal monger. At this point we are going to check out the rear main seal, which is right behind this flex plate. Let's look at how we remove this rear main seal. The seal has dimples on its surface where we can start a drill. Okay, make a hole. Then find the screw that's about the right size to go in the hole. There. Now we just need a pair of pliers to get behind the screw. There we go. Here's a new rear main seal back in place. You just grease it up and push it on, then we tap it on using the old seal. There's the backing plate, has a dimple, matches a dimple right there. Flexplate. Line up the holes. Then one more plate, cover plate. Then we're going to just start some of these bolts. Okay, once we have them all started, we're going to take them out one by one. Put Loctite on them. Just blue Loctite. And then we'll torque them to spec. The torque on these flywheel bolts is an unbelievable 61 foot-pounds. And there, we're done. Now we're going to see if we can wrestle this new transmission into place. Okay, so there it is nearly lined up. And all I got to do is get it up onto those studs. So there it's on the studs. All I got to do is straighten it out a little bit and slide it forward. Okay, so it all shifted forward a little bit, but it's now on the studs and it's close enough that I can start the bolts and pull it in the rest of the way. there you have it, the power of the screw. These top side bolts are mounted, and the torque for these bolts is 47 foot-pounds. "47 foot-pounds is not a lot of torque." The torque for these bolts for the transmission mount on top of the transmission is 47 foot-pounds, and the torque for this transmission mount on the front is also 47 foot-pounds. The transmission is mounted, all the bolts are torqued, and we just need to reconnect the sensors on the harness. And as a final check, before we proceed with reinstalling the drivetrain, we spin the crankshaft. Okay, always do this. Spin your crankshaft. Let's go for a couple of turns. Okay. Thing I do before trying to go back into the car is to level the assembly. The rear bank has to be tilted at an angle, and then we want the level of the top valve cover to be level. So that means with the engine oil pan resting on the dolly, we need to put like a little 1x block under the transmission oil pan, and this levels it. And here's a view of how it's leveled. These two transmissions have traded places. So while I have the engine out, I'm going to show you the lift points of the engine and how I go about lifting it. One lift point is on the rear head. You have two bosses for M8 by 1.25 bolts. And what I've done is I've fabricated a hanger out of it's actually a heavy-duty door hinge that I've drilled some holes in the right positions, and then can attach a chain. On the front head, you have the same thing, two M8 by 1.25 bosses, fabricate a hanger, attach a chain. So the engine can be lifted by these 2 points, just like this. What can I say except that installation is the reverse of removal? So there we have one 2GR-FE engine ready to go back in the car. I've positioned the engine and transmission almost exactly where they need to be. Looking down on the transmission mount, it's only about another 2 inches where the transmission mount can slide into its bracket. I've lowered it down a little further, and now it is literally within a fraction of an inch of where it needs to be. So with just one little tap of the hammer, I was able to drive the mounting bolt all the way through. And this is the beauty of leveling the assembly before lowering the car down. Let's look at what we have going on the engine side. So the motor mount was removed earlier, and everything is in about the right position. We're going to try putting the motor mount back on. To get the motor mount back on, it's beneficial to move the AC lines out of the way, and they have a bracket with one M6 attachment bolt right down here, so they can be moved. So with a little bit of jiggling, I was able to get all but one of the bolts mounted. The only bolt remaining is the one on the fender, but all of the other bolts for the motor mounts are snug, and this pretty much completes the mounting of the engine and transmission. And at this point, it's literally the reverse of removal to get everything back connected and in place. So this completes it. We didn't even have to use the crane for mounting the motor. Just by leveling the motor adequately, I was able to get it into its mounting points just by lowering the car onto it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.